Episode 24, Vito Rizzuto, Montreal's untouchable Don Hook and Rise. In the world of organized crime, few names command respect and fear, like Vito Rizzuto. Born in Cattolica Ericlea, Sicily, in 1946, Vito arrived in Montreal as a boy, carrying little more than family loyalty and an inherited code of silence. By the time he was a man, he wasn't just part of the Canadian Mafia. He was its undisputed king. This is the story of the man who built an empire in the shadows, survived the deadliest betrayals, and turned Montreal into his own private kingdom, until the day it all came crashing down. This is Mob Truth. Real stories, real mobsters. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join the family. To our new soldiers, welcome. Now, let's step into the shadows of Montreal. Building the Montreal Empire. The Rizzuto family didn't just operate in Montreal, they owned it. From the docks to the nightclubs, from construction unions to high-stakes gambling, nothing moved without their blessing, or their cut. Vito's rise was strategic. He stayed out of the flashy spotlight that doomed so many mobsters before him, choosing instead to operate as the quiet diplomat, the man who could settle disputes between rival factions without a single shot fired. At least not right away. He forged alliances with biker gangs, street crews, and even the New York Mafia, making Montreal a key hub in the transatlantic drug trade. Cocaine from South America, heroin from Europe, all flowing through Canadian ports under Rizzuto control. But while Vito projected calm on the surface, every move was calculated. In the shadows, enemies were marked, debts were collected, and power was consolidated. Shadows of power. By the late 1980s, Vito Rizzuto wasn't just respected. He was feared in boardrooms and back alleys alike. His network was so vast, police wiretaps often picked up conversations where rivals referred to him only as the man, as if speaking his name carried risk. But his greatest weapon wasn't muscle. It was diplomacy laced with menace. When disputes erupted between factions, Rizzuto's presence alone could end them. Not because he asked, but because everyone knew the alternative was worse. Yet beneath the surface, Vito was engineering something far more dangerous. He began positioning Montreal as a neutral zone for international meetings, a place where Sicilians, Calabrians, bikers, and cartels could talk business without immediate bloodshed. It was a move that elevated him beyond Canada's borders, but it also drew the eyes of dangerous men who weren't used to sharing power. And one day, a call from New York would change everything. The triple murder. The call from New York wasn't a request, it was an order. In 1981, the Bonanno crime family was in turmoil. 3 renegade captains were plotting to overthrow the leadership. The word from Sicily was clear: take them out. Vito Rizzuto, ever the diplomat, could have walked away. Montreal was his kingdom, and New York politics were not his problem. But loyalty and opportunity spoke louder. By lending his hand to the Bonannos, he would cement an alliance with one of the 5 families, ensuring protection and influence that stretched from Little Italy to the St. Lawrence River. On May 5, 1981, in a Brooklyn social club, Vito allegedly led a team of gunmen into a room where the 3 captains sat. Within seconds, gunfire and chaos turned the quiet meeting into a bloodbath. When it was over, the bodies of Philip Giacconi, Dominic Trinchera, and Alphonse Indelicato lay lifeless. And Vito Rizzuto walked away, a ghost in the city. But the ripples from that night would follow him for decades, and across continents. Power without borders. After Brooklyn, Vito returned to Montreal like nothing happened. There were no police raids, no public accusations, just whispers in the underworld that the Canadian Don had proven himself on New York's stage. The Bonanno alliance unlocked new doors. Rizzuto's crews now moved product through the same shipping routes as the 5 families, doubling profits and tightening control over the ports. In the clubs and cafes of Montreal's Little Italy, his name became untouchable currency, a man you didn't cross, because there was nowhere on the continent you could hide. But with power came paranoia. Rivals who once dismissed Vito as the quiet one now saw him as a threat that needed watching. Police surveillance intensified. Informants crept closer. Still, Vito thrived, keeping his hands clean while others did the dirty work. What he didn't know was that, far away in an FBI evidence locker, a dusty folder marked Brooklyn 1981 was about to be reopened, and it had his name all over it. The FBI comes knocking. By the early 2000s, the quiet diplomacy that had shielded Vito for decades was beginning to crack. Across the border, the FBI was breathing new life into cold Mafia cases, determined to connect the dots from Brooklyn back to Montreal. The triple murder of 1981 had never faded from memory. New witnesses were talking, old associates were flipping, and the Bonanno family, now riddled with informants, was bleeding secrets. For the first time, Vito's name wasn't just whispered in dark corners. It was printed in official FBI briefings. In January 2004, agents moved in. Working with Canadian authorities, they arrested Vito Rizzuto at his Montreal home. Neighbors watched in shock as the man they thought was a real estate developer was led away in handcuffs. But even in custody, Vito didn't flinch. No shouting, no protests, just the calm stare of a man who knew the game wasn't over. Because in the world of the Mafia, prison could be just another office, if you had the right reach. The prison Don Vito Rizzuto was extradited to the United States in 2006, facing charges for his role in the 1981 triple murder. In court, the FBI laid out its case: eyewitness accounts, surveillance, and the testimony of mobsters who had once called him a friend. But even stripped of his tailored suits and seated behind a defense table, Vito carried himself like a man still in command. Witnesses avoided his eyes, prosecutors watched him closely, and the press dubbed him Montreal's Teflon Don. In 2007, Vito pleaded guilty to racketeering, a strategic move that spared him a potential life sentence. He was handed 10 years in a U.S. federal prison. To most men, it would have been the end of their reign. To Vito, it was a temporary relocation. Inside, he moved carefully. No loud displays of power, no reckless alliances. But quietly, through coded messages and trusted intermediaries, the Rizzuto machine kept turning in Montreal. Enemies were eliminated, debts collected, and business continued. Still, time has a way of shifting the balance of power. And while Vito served his sentence, cracks began to form in the empire he had spent decades building. Return to a city on fire. In October 2012, Vito Rizzuto walked out of prison a free man, but the Montreal he returned to was unrecognizable. During his absence, his father and son had been murdered. Trusted lieutenants were either dead, jailed, or working for rivals. What was once a unified empire was now a fractured battlefield. For most men, the loss would have been crushing. For Vito, it was fuel. Within weeks, a bloody wave of retribution swept across the city. Gunmen struck in broad daylight, cars exploded, and one by one, the names on Vito's enemies list were crossed out. Police and media called it the Montreal Mafia War. On the streets, it was understood as one thing: the Don was back, and this time he wasn't negotiating. But revenge carries a cost. By late 2013, Vito's health was failing. On December 23rd, he died of natural causes in a Montreal hospital, leaving behind a legacy that remains both feared and admired. The final campaign, Vito's return, had reignited the old order, but it was also a race against time. Every move he made in 2012 and 2013 was deliberate, restoring alliances, reclaiming rackets, and eliminating anyone who had dared to challenge the Rizzuto name. Enemies didn't just disappear quietly. Bodies were found in burned-out cars, riddled with bullets, or dumped in remote fields. It was a message as clear as any handshake. Montreal belonged to the Rizzutos again. But the campaign wasn't only about vengeance. Vito worked to re-establish Montreal as a neutral meeting ground for international crime groups, just as he had in the 1980s. For a brief moment, it looked as if he might succeed in uniting the fractured underworld. Then came the whispers that his health was deteriorating, that the stress of the war and years behind bars had taken their toll. Close associates noticed he had lost weight, that his once commanding presence was dimming. Still, the Don pushed forward, unwilling to show weakness. because in his world, weakness was a death sentence. Enemies in the shadows. Even as Vito's enemies fell one by one, the war was far from over. Some rivals had gone underground, biding their time, waiting for a moment when the Don's attention was elsewhere. Others fled Montreal entirely, setting up operations in Toronto, New York, or overseas, hoping distance would protect them. But Vito's reach was long. In 2013 alone, police across Canada recorded a spike in contract killings linked to the Montreal Mafia war. The targets weren't just gangsters. They were lawyers, businessmen, and even former allies who had betrayed the Rizzuto name. Law enforcement tried to stem the bloodshed with raids and surveillance, but witnesses were scarce. Fear was Vito's greatest weapon. No one wanted to be the next name on his list. Still, in quiet moments, some in his circle began to wonder, could the Don win this war before his body gave out? Or would the streets claim another Rizzuto before the smoke cleared? Closing the accounts by mid-2013, Vito Rizzuto's war felt less like chaos and more like bookkeeping. Every debt, every betrayal, every grudge from his years behind bars was being settled, permanently. Some hits were surgical, a single bullet in a crowded cafe, the gunman gone before anyone screamed. Others were spectacles, cars left smoldering in the street, bodies found with unmistakable calling cards meant to send a message. The pattern was clear. This wasn't random violence. It was strategy. Vito was tying off loose ends, ensuring that when the dust settled, no one would be left to challenge him or his bloodline. But the more bodies that fell, the more pressure mounted from police, the media, and rival factions abroad. Rumors swirled that certain European crime families were uneasy with the scale of the violence, fearing it would draw too much heat to international operations. And while the outside world saw a ruthless mob war, those closest to Vito could see something else. A man racing against an invisible clock. A city holds its breath. By autumn 2013, Montreal was a city living on edge. Every week brought another headline. A gang leader gunned down in traffic, a warehouse fire linked to the Mafia, a high-profile businessman vanishing without a trace. In cafes, conversations dropped to whispers when Vito's name came up. Police patrols were heavier in Little Italy, but even officers admitted privately that they were just spectators in a war they couldn't stop. Behind closed doors, Vito was relentless. Meetings ran late into the night, his lieutenants reporting on every territory, every ally, every suspected traitor. Maps were marked, strategies drawn, and orders given, always with the same calm precision he'd shown his entire career. But there was one thing even Vito couldn't control: his health. Doctors urged rest, but the Don refused to slow down. He knew that if he paused for even a moment, someone else would seize the initiative. And in the Mafia, hesitation was fatal. The last move's winter was settling over Montreal, but the city's underworld was anything but quiet. In the final weeks of 2013, Vito ordered some of his boldest strikes yet. Operations carried out in broad daylight, in busy neighborhoods, leaving no doubt that the Rizzuto name still carried absolute weight. Some targets were personal. Others were calculated eliminations of men who had stepped into the power vacuum during his prison years. Each one was a reminder that the Don was still capable of reaching anyone, anywhere. But in the shadows, whispers began to circulate, not of defiance, but of inevitability. Those closest to Vito knew he was pushing himself beyond the limits. His once confident stride had slowed, his voice occasionally raspy. Even his most loyal soldiers wondered how much longer he could keep up the pace. Still, Vito refused to let anyone see weakness. To the last, he played the part of Montreal's untouchable king, a man who would rather burn the city down than hand it over. A war without end. As December 2013 approached, Montreal's streets felt like a chessboard where every piece had been bloodied. The killings had slowed compared to the war's peak, but tension hung heavy in the air. Rivals were gone, but the fear remained. Fear of who might step forward to fill the void if Vito faltered. Police intelligence reports hinted at new threats abroad. Factions in Sicily watching closely, South American suppliers weighing their loyalty, and whispers from New York that some Bonanno associates questioned whether Vito's grip would last. Vito, ever the strategist, saw it differently. To him, the war wasn't about winning or losing. It was about sending a final, unshakable message. The Rizzuto name could not be erased. Even as his health worsened, he worked the phones, met with allies, and kept his enemies guessing until the very last days. But time, the one enemy no mobster can defeat, was closing in fast. The Don's final winner. By mid-December 2013, Vito Rizzuto's once iron health had deteriorated sharply. Even so, he refused to vanish from sight. Associates recall him attending meetings wrapped in a heavy coat, voice firm but weaker than before, eyes still carrying that sharp, calculating glare. On the streets, the war had largely quieted. Most who had opposed him were gone, either buried or exiled. But Vito knew better than to believe in peace. In the Mafia, calm was just the silence before the next storm. Despite the toll on his body, he kept making calls, sending instructions, and ensuring every piece of his empire was aligned. There was no talk of succession, no hint that the Rizzuto reign might end. To acknowledge such things would have been to admit defeat. Then just days before Christmas, word spread that the Don had been admitted to a Montreal hospital. The official reason was pneumonia. Those who knew him understood the truth. The war had taken more than bullets ever could. The last command. From his hospital bed, Vito Rizzuto remained the Don. Visitors came and went in carefully staggered intervals, some longtime allies paying their respects, others arriving with final updates on business. Even in a weakened state, Vito listened closely, giving quiet instructions with the same measured tone he had used his entire career. Outside the hospital, unmarked police cars lingered, hoping to catch sight of who was coming and going. Reporters camped nearby, waiting for any scrap of news. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, almost reverent. Those closest to him later said that in those final days, Vito spoke less about revenge and more about order, about leaving behind a structure that would keep the Rizzuto name alive. He knew the throne would not sit empty for long, and he intended for the right man to claim it. Even as his strength faded, there was no surrender. Vito's last command to his men was simple: make sure they remember who we are. The final hours, December 23, 2013. Snow fell steadily over Montreal, blanketing the city in silence. Inside the hospital, the Don's condition had worsened overnight. Machines hummed softly, nurses moved quietly, and the small group of loyal men in the waiting area spoke in low, guarded tones. Those who were allowed into his room that morning described the same scene. Vito resting with his eyes half open, still alert enough to recognize familiar faces. A faint nod here, a brief glance there, but no wasted words. Outside, news had already begun to spread in the underworld. From Montreal to New York, to Sicily, phones buzzed with the same question. Was the untouchable Don finally at the end? By late afternoon, his breathing had grown shallow. One associate standing closest to the bed swore he heard Vito whisper a final line in Italian, words that would never be repeated publicly. Moments later, the man who had ruled Montreal's underworld for decades slipped away quietly, without the drama that had marked so much of his life. The news breaks him. By the evening of December 23, 2013, the news had spread beyond the hospital walls. Montreal's underworld felt the shift instantly. The king was gone. In cafes and bars across Little Italy, regulars spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if the walls themselves were listening. Police confirmed the death to the media within hours, framing it as the end of an era. But in the streets, there was no sense of closure, only uncertainty. The man who had balanced alliances, kept rival factions in check, and held a city together through sheer willpower was no longer there to keep the peace. In New York, Sicily, and South America, old partners and enemies alike took note. Some saw opportunity, others feared the chaos his absence could unleash. And in Montreal, the remaining Rizzuto loyalists gathered quietly, already debating who would take the reins and how long they could keep them. The war, it seemed, might not be over after all. The power vacuum. In the weeks after Vito Rizzuto's death, Montreal's criminal underworld entered a dangerous state of limbo. Without the Don's steady hand, the fragile peace he had forced on the city began to fray. Old grudges resurfaced. Former allies eyed each other with suspicion. Whispers of betrayal grew louder with every passing day. Police intelligence warned of a potential surge in violence. They weren't wrong. By early 2014, scattered shootings and arson attacks signaled that the fight for control had already begun. Some factions hoped to keep the Rizzuto legacy alive. Others saw the moment as their chance to wipe the name from the streets entirely. Yet even in death, Vito's influence lingered. The alliances he had forged and the fear he had cultivated still shaped decisions across the continent. In some corners, it was said that his blueprint for running Montreal's underworld was still being followed. A silent reminder that his reign had changed the game forever. Branded ending. This was the rise, reign, and fall of Vito Rizzuto, Montreal's untouchable Don. A man who turned a city into his empire, built alliances that spanned continents, and proved that power could be quiet until it needed to be loud. If you've been watching this far, hit that subscribe button and join the family. To our new soldiers, welcome to Mob Truth. More real stories, more real mobsters, and we're just getting started.